They called him mad. Even his own men whispered about it in the mess halls. A general who was willing to gamble everything, planes, pilots, and pride, just to change the tide of a war that seemed endless. But what no one expected was that his reckless idea would burn the heart out of the Luftwaffe in a matter of weeks. The winter of 1944 hung heavy over Europe. For years, Germany's Luftwaffe had ruled the skies with ruthless precision. Their fighters, sleek, fast, and deadly, had terrorized bomber crews, torn Allied formations apart, and made every mission into a flying death sentence. Each time the bombers crossed into enemy territory, dozens didn't come back. The airfields of England echoed with the silence of missing wings. Families waited for letters that never arrived. The Allied air campaign against Nazi Germany was supposed to break the Reich's war machine, cripple its factories, its fuel lines, its morale. But by late 1943, it seemed the opposite was happening. The Luftwaffe wasn't broken, it was thriving. Their pilots were aces, their defenses brutal. Allied bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator could take punishment, yes, but without protection, they were easy prey. Every high command meeting turned into a blame game. The brass demanded results. The crews demanded answers. But there was one man, one general, who refused to accept the idea that the Luftwaffe was unbeatable. He was brash, confident, and unafraid to break every rule in the book. His name was James Harold Doolittle. To the public, Doolittle was already a legend, the man who had led the daring Tokyo raid after Pearl Harbor, flying B-25 bombers off an aircraft carrier in an operation no sane commander would have attempted. But that was only the beginning. By late 1943, Doolittle had been handed command of the U.S. 8th Air Force in Europe, a force battered and demoralized by constant losses. The skies over Germany had become graveyards of aluminum and fire. When Doolittle arrived in England, he studied the situation with cold precision. The problem wasn't courage. His pilots had plenty of that. The problem was strategy. The bombers flew deep into Germany, relying on tight formations and defensive gunfire to protect themselves. Their escort fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolts and early P-38 Lightnings, could only accompany them part of the way before turning back, low on fuel. Once the fighters left, the Luftwaffe pounced. The results were catastrophic. Dozens of bombers were shot down in a single mission. Sometimes entire squadrons disappeared into smoke. Morale was collapsing. But Doolittle saw something everyone else had missed. To win the war in the air, he realized you couldn't just defend. You had to hunt. It was an idea that terrified his peers. Up until that point, fighter escorts were told to stay glued to bombers, forming a defensive shield. It was safe, predictable, and utterly ineffective against the cunning German tactics. The Luftwaffe would send waves of fighters to probe the edges of the formation, drawing escorts away, then dive in to slaughter the bombers. Doolittle wanted to flip the entire system upside down. He called it offensive escorting. His new orders were radical. Fighters would no longer fly alongside the bombers like sheepdogs. They would leave the formation, chase down enemy planes, and engage wherever they found them. The objective wasn't just to protect the bombers anymore. The new mission was to destroy the Luftwaffe. To many, it sounded insane. To others, suicidal. Senior commanders feared that sending fighters off on their own would leave the bombers completely exposed. Doolittle didn't argue. He simply said, "You can't win a fight by hiding behind someone else." But even a bold plan needs the right weapon. And right around that same time, a new fighter was arriving in England, a sleek, silver machine that would change air combat forever. The North American P-51 Mustang. With its long range, blistering speed, and razor-edge handling, the Mustang was everything the bombers had prayed for. It could go all the way to Berlin and back. For the first time, the Allies had a fighter that could meet the Germans on equal ground and outfly them. Doolittle wasted no time. He restructured entire fighter groups, retrained pilots, and rewrote tactics overnight. The new order spread across air bases like wildfire. Your job isn't to babysit bombers. Your job is to destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it hides. The pilots were shocked. For years they had been drilled to protect, not to pursue. But Doolittle believed in unleashing their instincts. He told them to dive, chase, and fight aggressively, to attack airfields, trains, even enemy pilots parachuting back to base, to strike fear into the German skies. And it worked, at first in whispers. The first missions under the new plan saw chaos and confusion. Escort formations scattered across the sky. Pilots were unsure when to leave or where to strike. Some bomber crews cursed Doolittle's name, convinced he was dooming them. But slowly, results began to emerge. The Luftwaffe's confident attacks started to falter. German pilots, expecting to find easy targets, were now ambushed mid-climb, caught off guard by swarms of Mustangs diving out of the sun. Airfields that had once been safe havens were now death traps, strafed by low-flying American fighters. Fuel convoys burned. Hangars exploded. The once invincible Luftwaffe was bleeding from 1,000 cuts. Still, to the press and even some inside command, Doolittle was the mad general. His methods defied convention. His aggression was called reckless. But Doolittle didn't care about reputation. He cared about results. He understood something the others didn't. Wars are not won by caution. They're won by breaking the enemy's rhythm, by forcing them to fight on your terms. Behind the scenes, Doolittle's pilots began to notice something eerie. Every week, the skies felt a little emptier. Missions that used to bring swarms of German interceptors now saw only a handful. At first, they thought it was a trap, but it wasn't. The Luftwaffe was starting to crumble, and no one could believe how fast it was happening. Within just a few weeks, Doolittle's reckless strategy had shifted the entire balance of air power. The hunter had become the hunted. The question was, how far would this mad general go to finish the job? Because what he was about to do next would push the limits of air warfare and change forever how the world fought for control of the skies. The morning fog still hung low over the airfields of East Anglia when the engines of hundreds of P-51 Mustangs began to roar to life. Mechanics waved their rags and stepped back as the silver fighters, lined up like an army of sharks, rolled toward the runways. The mission orders were brief but unmistakable: free hunt. To most Allied pilots, those two words were electric. It meant no fixed escort, no formation limits. It meant they could go where the enemy was and strike first. What had once been a desperate defensive struggle was now open season on the Luftwaffe. Doolittle had unleashed something entirely new, a storm of precision and aggression. The skies that had once belonged to the Germans were suddenly alive with American fighters in every direction. Instead of clustering tightly around the bomber streams, they fanned out across Europe, prowling above enemy airfields, railway lines, and even roads where convoys tried to move fuel and ammunition. In the first few weeks, chaos ruled the radio waves. Pilots reported contacts everywhere. Bandits at 3 o'clock, fighters over Hanover, dozens diving out of clouds. What was once a measured air campaign had turned into a relentless hunt. At German air bases, the shock was immediate. Luftwaffe pilots had grown used to predictable battles. They would wait until the bomber formations appeared on radar, climb to altitude, and pick off stragglers. But now, before they could even reach the bombers, their own bases were under attack. Mustangs swept in low, machine guns blazing, cutting through parked aircraft, refueling trucks, and even the runways themselves. One German mechanic later recalled, "We could not even start the engines. They came before we were ready, always out of sun." It wasn't just a surprise, it was a sheer relentlessness. Every day, from dawn till dusk, Allied fighters appeared where they weren't supposed to be. Doolittle's new doctrine had turned air war into psychological warfare. The results were staggering. Between February and March 1944, Luftwaffe losses skyrocketed. Entire squadrons vanished. Replacement pilots were rushed to the front, barely trained, facing seasoned American aces with hundreds of hours of combat time. German command struggled to understand how the tide had turned so violently. And behind all of it was a man they called reckless. James Doolittle's genius lay not just in strategy, but in understanding people. He knew his fighter pilots, their hunger for freedom, their need to fight on instinct rather than orders. He gave them that freedom, and in doing so, turned them into the most efficient killing force in the air. He told them, "Your target is not just the enemy aircraft, It's their will to fly. Doolittle's transformation of the 8th Air Force didn't just save bombers. It rewired the entire concept of air superiority. One of his favorite groups, the 4th Fighter Group, nicknamed the Debden Eagles, quickly became legends under his command. They embraced the hunt like predators, painting victory tallies on their planes faster than anyone could keep track. Names like George Preddy, Don Gentile, and Bud Anderson became whispered legends among pilots. Gentile, known as the Ace of Aces, was so aggressive he once chased a Messerschmitt 109 all the way to the deck and shot it down just above the trees, then nearly crashed himself in the dive. When asked later what drove him, he simply said, "Doolittle told us to bring the fight to them, so that's what we did." But this wasn't just about bravery, it was mathematics. By forcing the Luftwaffe into constant battle over its own territory, Doolittle ensured that German losses could never be replaced. Their pilots who bailed out landed back in Germany, but the Allies' downed airmen were gone for good. Doolittle knew that to defeat an air force, you had to destroy not just its planes, but its pilots. And that's exactly what began to happen. By early spring, German training schools were emptying. The Luftwaffe had to rush teenagers into combat, boys barely out of flight school, thrown into cockpits to face Americans with twice their flight time and better machines. The skill gap was catastrophic. Meanwhile, the bombers were suddenly making it home. Losses dropped sharply. Missions that had once cost 60 or 70 aircraft now returned with barely a handful missing. The effect on morale was electric. Crews that had once felt like flying targets now had a fighting chance. The skies over Germany were no longer German. Then came the missions that would break the Luftwaffe's back entirely, the big week raids. In February 1944, Doolittle and his staff planned a series of massive, coordinated strikes across Germany, targeting aircraft factories, fuel depots, and repair yards. It was designed not just to destroy machines, but to force the Luftwaffe into the air, to make them fight and die in the open. It worked flawlessly. Day after day, hundreds of bombers went in, with Doolittle's fighters ahead, above, and behind them. Every time the Germans scrambled to intercept, they were swarmed by Mustangs and Thunderbolts diving from every direction. The skies over Leipzig, Regensburg, and Stuttgart turned into fiery chaos. By the end of the week, the Luftwaffe had lost over 1/3 of its operational fighters. Many of its top aces were dead, and the factories that produced replacements were now smoking ruins. Doolittle's strategy wasn't just winning, it was annihilating. But what made it so effective wasn't just the tactics. It was timing. He had introduced his aggressive approach precisely when the Allies had the tools to make it unstoppable. Long-range fighters, drop tanks for endurance, and an endless supply of trained pilots. German General Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most respected aces, later admitted, "We had no chance. We could no longer control our own airspace." By April, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Pilots were exhausted, fuel was running out, and Allied air superiority was complete. Yet Doolittle kept pushing. He ordered his fighters to dive lower, strike deeper, rail lines, convoys, bridges, anything that moved. The objective had evolved beyond air supremacy. Now it was total domination. Even among the Allies, there were murmurs of unease. Some commanders thought Doolittle's attacks on airfields and ground targets were excessive, almost ruthless. But he saw the bigger picture. Every truck burned. Every train destroyed meant fewer supplies for the German army on the ground. He wasn't just fighting the Luftwaffe anymore. He was paving the way for the D-Day invasion. Still, there was a strange silence in the air by mid-1944. The once roaring German fighters had nearly vanished. Some missions flew deep into Germany without a single interception. For the bomber crews, it was eerie relief. For the fighter pilots, it was almost disappointing. The hunt was ending. But for Doolittle, it was confirmation. His reckless gamble had worked. He had done what no one thought possible. He had shattered the most feared air force in the world, not in years, but in weeks. What followed was something even he couldn't have predicted. How this short, furious campaign in the skies would change the fate of the war on the ground. Because as the Luftwaffe burned, the Allies prepared to launch the greatest invasion in history. And Doolittle's mad strategy would prove to be the key that unlocked Europe itself. June 6, 1944. Dawn broke over the English Channel in a haze of smoke and thunder. The largest armada in human history was moving toward the beaches of Normandy. Thousands of ships stretched the horizon, and above them, cutting to the clouds, were the fighters and bombers of the U.S. 8th Air Force. The invasion had begun, but for the men in those cockpits, something felt strange. The skies were quiet. No swarms of Messerschmitts, no screaming Stukas diving through the clouds. The Luftwaffe, the same air force that had once terrorized Europe, was nowhere to be seen. Doolittle's reckless strategy had done more than protect the bombers. It had cleared the skies of resistance for the D-Day landings. The German pilots, who might have shredded the invasion fleet, never got off the ground. Their planes were wrecked, their fuel depots in flames, their morale crushed. In just 4 months, Doolittle had achieved what years of cautious flying had failed to do. He hadn't just defeated the Luftwaffe. He had erased it as a fighting force. The reports that poured into Allied command painted a picture no one had dared to hope for. German air activity over France had collapsed. Their radar stations were blinded, their airfields cratered. When Luftwaffe squadrons tried to intercept, they were met by waves of Mustangs and Thunderbolts that tore them apart before they could reach altitude. It was a complete destruction of the enemy's ability to fight, but it had come at a cost. Doolittle's new doctrine, bold, fast, and unforgiving, had demanded constant aggression. Many of his pilots never came home. Some crashed deep in enemy territory. Others disappeared over the channel. For every victory tally painted on a Mustang's nose, there was a missing wingman who would never return. And yet, even among those who fell, there was an understanding. They were part of something that had changed the very nature of war. Doolittle himself wasn't one for celebration. While others toasted the success of D-Day, he stood silent, watching the maps and weather reports, already planning the next strike. To him, every battle was just another step toward ending the war faster and saving more lives in the long run. He often said, "The quickest way home is straight through the enemy." After Normandy, Doolittle's fighters continued their relentless advance eastward, sweeping over France, Belgium, and into Germany itself. The Luftwaffe tried to recover, but it was too late. Their seasoned aces were gone, their replacements were barely trained, and fuel shortages had grounded entire squadrons. By late 1944, the once mighty German air arm existed only in fragments. The few aircraft that still took off were outnumbered 10-1. They fought bravely, but they were ghosts in a sky that no longer belonged to them. Then came the final blow, the American raids over Berlin. For years, the German capital had been a symbol of defiance. Its anti-aircraft guns, its searchlights, its propaganda, all said the same thing. Berlin was untouchable. But Doolittle's 8th Air Force was determined to prove otherwise. As hundreds of B-17s roared toward the city, flanked by squadrons of P-51s, the German defenders scrambled what few planes they had left. The result was one of the last great air battles over Europe, and one of the most one-sided in history. Within hours, the skies above Berlin were filled with smoke and falling wreckage. Entire formations of Luftwaffe fighters were wiped out before they could even form up. The survivors, out of ammunition and fuel, limped back to bases that no longer existed. That day marked the end of the Luftwaffe as a credible fighting force, and with it, the end of Germany's hope of controlling the air. Historians would later call Doolittle's transformation of the 8th Air Force one of the most decisive strategic shifts of World War II. But in the moment, for the men who lived it, it was simpler. They called it freedom. Freedom from being targets. Freedom from running. Freedom to fight back and win. It's easy to forget now, looking back to the lens of history, just how desperate things were before Doolittle took command. The idea of sending bombers deep into Germany was almost madness. Losses were unsustainable. Airmen joked grimly that their odds of surviving a 25-mission tour were lower than a coin flip. Then came a man the newspapers called reckless, the general who told his men to throw the rulebook out the window and take the war to the enemy. In reality, Doolittle wasn't reckless. He was revolutionary. He understood something few others dared to admit, that air power was not just about defending territory or protecting assets. It was about breaking the enemy's will to fight. He knew that an air war fought cautiously would always be lost slowly. But an air war fought relentlessly, that could end everything in a matter of weeks. And he was right. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine and pushed into Germany in early 1945, the Luftwaffe was finished. Its hangars were empty. Its fuel was gone. Its young pilots, barely old enough to shave, were being sent on suicide missions against endless formations of American and British aircraft. What Doolittle's mad strategy had done was more than tactical. It was psychological. He'd turned the hunter into the hunted. For the first time since the war began, it was the Germans who looked up and felt fear. Even the enemy would later acknowledge it. General Galland, one of Germany's greatest aces, wrote after the war, "The Mustang was the best fighter of the war, and Doolittle was the man who used it best. He broke us." And in that quiet admission lay the legacy of a man once dismissed as reckless. By war's end, Doolittle's name had become legend, not because he sought glory, but because he dared to change everything when it mattered most. He had taken a shattered force and rebuilt it into a weapon of precision and terror. He had gambled everything on a single, dangerous idea, and won. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, lay in ruins. Its skies, once filled with the thunder of German engines, now echoed with silence. As peace returned, Doolittle retired from active command, humble as always, refusing to call himself a hero. But those who had flown under him knew the truth. They had seen how one man's courage to defy convention could change the fate of nations. Years later, a young pilot was asked what it was like to fly under Doolittle's orders during those desperate months. He thought for a long moment, then said softly, "He taught us how to fight and how to win. But more than that, he taught us not to be afraid of the impossible." And that may have been James Doolittle's greatest victory of all. Because history often remembers wars for their tanks, their generals, their battles. But in the war for Europe, it was a man's so-called madness, his willingness to risk everything in the open sky, that changed the world forever. A reckless idea, a mad general, and a strategy so bold, it destroyed the Luftwaffe in weeks. Not by luck, not by chance, but by sheer, unrelenting belief that sometimes, to save the world, you have to dare the impossible, the end.